This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. If you ask education journalists whose stories they watch for and are often inspired by, the name Casey Parks is at the top of many lists. She spent 10 years on the staff of the Oregonian and has written for a wide range of publications, including the Hechinger Report, the New Yorker, and the New York Times. She recently joined the Washington Post, where she'll cover gender and family issues. She's with us today to talk about her most recent narrative journalism project, a close look at a rural school district in Mississippi that's fighting for survival. It was part of her work as a Spencer Education Fellow at Columbia University. Casey, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much. You make me sound way better than I actually am, but I'm a huge fan of yours and of EWA Radio, so happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Casey. I forgot to mention modest. I forgot to add in the little modest disclaimer there. No, but I mean, I think it's true. I think when your byline shows up, especially on the education beat, it's something that people take note of. So I'm curious, when you think about this, why was this a story that you wanted to tell, to look at what the headline says is the tragedy of rural schools in America?
Well, it's actually quite a personal story. I grew up in Louisiana, and all of my family is from rural Louisiana. And for the last 11 years, I've been working on a book that's not education related, but it is in this small town that my mom grew up in. And the way the media talks about rural America didn't exactly square with my experiences of being there. It just felt like very stereotypical, and every piece of rural America coverage was just like somebody slumped over their steering wheel at Walmart because their factory job went away. And there is some of that, but it just didn't feel like it told the full story. It just kind of limited it. And then the reason that I really got involved in this story is my mother died in 2018, and she was only 53, and she was a pain pill addict. And she was incredibly smart. She made a 34 on the ACT, which she always reminded me of because I did not make a 34 on the ACT. And she read all the time, and she used words like mellifluous and transmogrify. But she never went to college because she got pregnant with me in high school. And the local college told her she couldn't go to college because she was pregnant. And there was no one at her high school who really talked to her about college or talked to her about what to do. And so she just cleaned houses for most of her life. She occasionally did some bookkeeping work or answered phones, but really her brilliance was just squandered. And consequently, she was really depressed and had a lot of mental health issues, which led her to pain pills. And I just kept thinking, like, would her life have been different if she hadn't lived in rural Louisiana? And I really didn't know what to do with my grief, so I just started acting like a reporter and pulling Department of Agriculture reports on rural America, and started just researching rural schools just personally, just to see, like, is what my mother experienced, what other people experience. And the more I read, the more I just started to see, like, what a dire situation it was in a lot of places in rural America. Of course, there are wealthier communities that do great by rural schools, but a lot of the rural communities in the South are impoverished and don't have access to a lot of things. And in that research, I came across the Rural School and Community Trust. And for the last 20 years, they've been issuing rankings basically of like how each state is doing when it comes to rural education. And Mississippi tops the list every year as the state that needed the most help. I went to college in Mississippi. I love Mississippi. I'm always looking for a reason to go back. And sometimes I just use journalism as a reason to go home because I don't live in the South now, but I love being there. And sometimes it's emotionally hard for me to go there. But if I go there as a journalist, I can just kind of focus and like be in the midst of my home, but with a purpose to be there. So at that point, I had decided I wanted to write about a Mississippi rural community. And so then I just started pulling census data to see which community I might want to write about. And initially, I kind of followed the same playbook that most journalists do. I started looking for a factory that closed down. And I contacted a couple of places that had factories or had lost factories, and nothing really stood out to me. And then I found Holmes County, which is the county that I wrote about. And I called the superintendent, and he had actually just started there, and he was just such a great talker. He actually had been a journalist himself, so he was a really good storyteller. And he had a really interesting personal story. And most crucially, he was open to me shadowing him for an entire year.
And of course, that is essential for this kind of a deep narrative work.
Yeah, I usually give people a spiel that's like, this is really going to suck. Do you still want to do this? Because I'm going to be bothering you for a very long time, and it's going to require so much free work on your behalf. So you really have to have a reason that you want to do it, because it sounds cool when somebody calls you and wants to write about you, but it's actually very time consuming and by the end, very annoying. And he was not bothered by that. He was still open to the idea. For schools, it's especially crucial because you're asking someone, can I get in and follow children around? And you need to know from the get-go that somebody is going to want to do that, because if they're already hesitant at the beginning of the year, they're definitely going to be hesitant by the end. And so he was open to it. And so at that point, I did just a small amount of reporting and then applied to the Columbia Spencer Fellowship to see if it was a story I could do.
So you focused on Holmes County Consolidated School District. This is a district that has struggled mightily to provide even what we would consider the most basic of supplies to its schools: science equipment for laboratory experiments, textbooks, adequate AC and shelter for kids to be warm or cool as they need to be to study during the day. But tell us a little bit about Harvey Ellington. How did you find him?
Harvey actually found me, which is kind of a reporter's dream. I had started writing just about the superintendent. He had a really interesting personal story. He had grown up in Holmes County and left in the 1980s because he had gone to the dentist and accidentally walked through the whites only door in 1984. And the dentist refused to treat him, even though he had an abscessed tooth. And so he had run away from Mississippi and had vowed never to return, but then in his 50s had kind of reconsidered and decided he wanted to go home and save his hometown school district. So I was really focused on him and hadn't planned to focus on a kid. And then in the midst of that, Harvey saw me at school, and I guess he thought that I looked like Ellen DeGeneres. I have brown hair, not blonde, but I do have short hair. And Ellen DeGeneres is from Louisiana also, but that's kind of, and I'm gay, but those are our only similarities. But anyway, he wrote me on Facebook to tell me that he wanted to meet me. So he came to meet me. And just from the moment he walked into the classroom, I knew he was a special kid. Like, he just had really great posture, which is not normal for teenagers. And I asked him if he played sports because he was kind of tall and a little bit muscular, and sports are a huge deal at the school. And he told me he couldn't play sports because he had anxiety. And I just thought that was so vulnerable for a teenage boy to tell a complete stranger. It just made me pretty taken with him from the beginning. And at that point, I just spent a day or two with him, and everything that he tried in those 2 days just went awry. Like, one of the principals had suggested that they make these documentaries for a C-SPAN competition, and you had to make it on an issue, and he wanted his to be about rural schools. And he showed up to all the meetings, and no one, not even the adults, showed up, and like no one helped him. He drafted all of these questions, and he had this whole plan, and just like people just kept letting him down. And then he didn't have teachers for some of his classes, so he was just sitting in the gym. As I was talking to him, I was like, so do you do this every day? You just sit in the gym? Like, what do you do? And he was showing me that he Googled pictures of England. And at that point, I just knew that he was extremely interesting and had a lot to show people. And so we started keeping in touch from there.
You know, Casey, you used a phrase earlier talking very poignantly about your mom's experience. It was squandered brilliance. And I think that does sum up what the reader takes away from Harvey's story. And I did feel that was devastating that at this age, a kid who's 15, 16 years old, he seems to have a very clear and keen understanding of what helps make a school a good school and what makes a kid want to be there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's really sad to watch because he does have all of that raw stuff. And sometimes you can take that raw stuff and make your own magic. But I mean, he doesn't even have the internet at his house. So, and I guess my mother didn't either when she was growing up. And she didn't probably have encyclopedias because they were expensive. But it can be hard to make your own magic if you are that marooned and there's no way to find things out. And I guess he can do the Googling pictures of England, but that can only take you so far if you don't have people showing you how to solve equations or how to structure an essay or any of those things. And I don't know that he does.
There's a lot of valuable data in your story, which helps to frame Harvey's experience within a larger context and in this problem of rural schools nationally. And you mentioned, of course, the Rural School and Community Trust is one of your trusted sources. I'm wondering, where else did you go to get the data?
Well, using data in this way is something that I learned when I went to Columbia University to get my master's. I know there's like a lot of people knocking Columbia on Twitter these days as being expensive, but I got a really good scholarship, and my salary that I make now is 3 times the salary I made at my last job. So it has been financially worth it for me, but even more than that, it's been academically worth it for me because when I worked at the Oregonian, I used to just Google rural school expert and just take whatever came up. But one thing the program that I did at Columbia really teaches you is how to research and how to find the right academics. Both going to Columbia and also doing the Spencer Fellowship also gives you access to Columbia's insane library holdings. At this point, I have never looked up a single thing in their library that they don't have, like just crazy, obscure stuff. They have everything. So that really was a huge boost to me. So I really just started when I was doing the Spencer by going to the Columbia Library and just pulling every book on rural education that they had. And then going through, sometimes I would look up Google Scholar and put rural education. And then as I started to see some trends, would dial down to like consolidation and then search for that. The problem with Google Scholar is you can't always see the full articles. So that's where having the Columbia Library access would really come in handy. But I think you can also often look up who the researcher is, and they usually work for schools. And I've written some and asked if they would send me their research, and often nobody is asking them for their research. They're really excited to send it to you for free. So one part of the thing of the Spencer Fellowship is you're supposed to get an academic mentor. And I could not find one because no one at either Teachers College or the surrounding schools education programs that focused on rural education.
Wow.
Which is telling in and of itself.
That's stunning.
Yeah, I went to the Teachers College and asked Jeffrey Hennig, who's connected to everybody, if there was anybody at all of Teachers College at Columbia who studied rural education, and he said no. So I went through the program without a mentor, and initially there were just a couple of books, and they were very focused on the Midwest, so they weren't fully helpful, though I did start to get a sense that consolidation wasn't the answer, which I had been surprised by because the narrative that lawmakers put out when doing consolidation sounds good. Like the idea is that you'll save money through an economy of scale. And that sounds like it would be true, but it's not actually.
I'm interested in how you organize a story of this kind of scale and scope. What's your process? Are you a spreadsheet person? Or do you create timelines? What do you do?
Oh, no, I'm not a spreadsheet person. I use Google Drive and make folders for every subject. I tape everything, and then I organize all of my transcriptions by date and then like a description of it. I will sometimes do timelines. I do think most narratives should primarily be chronological. I think you can have a scene and then one pivot in time backwards after that, but otherwise I don't think you should move around in time too much. I worked on this story for 3 years, and things started to get a little crazy of like not remembering where I found things. For the New York Times, you have to annotate your entire document, every single sentence. And as I was doing that, there were some stats I had in there that I was just like, where did I hear this or where did I get this? So then I had to like re-report myself, which is good because some of the data had actually changed in the 3 years that I had done it. But I do a lot of outlining for writing and just thinking. I'll reread all of my notes. That's every article that I read, every interview that I did, every piece of academic research. And then I move away from the computer, and on a piece of paper, I just write down everything that I think is important or interesting. And I generally believe if I don't remember it then, it's probably not that interesting. Like the things that stick with you are probably the things that are going to stick with writers. I will go double check to make sure I didn't miss anything, but usually I'm right that what stuck with me without looking at my notes to make a plan is the most interesting thing. But occasionally I miss something. But after that, I look at the list of things and I pick out, like, how do I want to structure the story by theme? And I try to make each section usually have a theme and be doing some kind of work. So you'll have a scene and that might illustrate one of these points. And those scenes should otherwise be chronological, I think.
We're talking with journalist Casey Parks about her news story for the New York Times Magazine, The Tragedy of America's Rural Schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. So I'm curious, though, as you started getting into some of the data on rural schools and knowing that this is a topic that does not get sufficient attention from the media generally, was there anything that really shocked or surprised as you were looking at some of these statistics?
Well, I was really surprised to find out that consolidation not only doesn't work the way people say it will, but that it can actually be very harmful. I know people often will talk about how it can be hurtful to a community to lose their school, but I didn't realize that it can cost more money because you have to buy extra school buses or other infrastructure, and that a lot of times student achievement actually goes down because kids are so disrupted by having to move to a different school or they're getting in a larger environment. I talked earlier about Columbia. One of the things they told us is that reporters often think because something sounds good, it must be true. And I think in the past, I would have heard a lawmaker say, we're going to save money because we're only going to have one superintendent instead of two. And I would have thought, yeah, that makes sense. I'll report that. I also truly had no idea how bad the teacher recruitment was in rural schools until I got there. One of the schools that I wrote about had no teachers in second grade. They only had substitutes, and then the substitutes weren't teaching the kids how to add. So when the third grade teacher got them and she was trying to teach them how to multiply, she found out that none of them knew how to add, which is particularly horrible for a school district because third grade is when they take the tests. And if they're already behind, she can't get them up to speed for the test. But they just truly could not get second grade teachers. And seeing Harvey just sit in the gym, right now he's missing 3 teachers. And each of those class periods is 80 minutes long. So he's spending 240 minutes a day in the gym doing nothing. I had no idea it was that hard to get teachers in those places.
You know, people do think of consolidation as some kind of a rescue package, as though the state's going to swoop in and take care of everything and pick up all the bills. But, I spent some time in Kansas for the Hechinger Report a couple of years ago, reporting on rural schools there. And I remember what one guy told me from the Chamber of Commerce. And he said, if we lose this school, that's it. It's the last nail in the coffin for this town.
One of the pieces I read in the commission reports on the consolidation for this story was the electric company came out and testified against it because the high school was their biggest customer. And the electric company was like, you're going to sink this electric company if you take this school away from us. I had not thought about the spillover effect in that way. I had thought, a town loses its hometown football team. But it actually does have huge repercussions for a town.
If I'm a local education reporter and I'm trying to make a pitch to my editor that we need to be paying attention to rural schools in our state, how do I make the case for that? Is this an accountability watchdog thing?
Well, first I would look up the rural communities and see how are their schools doing. And I'd maybe just reach out to a couple of principals and ask, like, do you have everything you need to succeed? Do you feel like the state is listening to you? Do you feel like your lawmakers are representing your needs? And then I would pull up your state strategic plan and just search for the word rural. When I did that in Mississippi, I found that the word does not appear at all. And so I asked the state, like, well, do y'all have any staff covering this? And they told me no. And actually, when the fact checker called, the person got upset and she was like, well, almost all of Mississippi is rural. Why do we need someone specifically doing that? But it's not exactly true. Only half of Mississippi is rural. But that mindset, I think, speaks to the answer. Like, rural schools have distinct problems and they require distinct solutions. But if no one is even paying attention to them, if they're like, what's good for the capital city is good for the whole state, like, that's not going to work for places. And oftentimes rural communities don't have enough representation in their state legislatures to really advocate the same way that a city might. So I think I would just start calling people and asking them, like, is there anything that you need that you're not getting? And then ask the state, like, how are you thinking about rural education?
Casey, you talked at the top of the interview a little bit about some of the misconceptions that people have about rural America generally. And I'm wondering, what advice do you have for education reporters, some of the tropes to avoid or some cautions they should take?
I don't think that journalists write about rural education enough for there to even be that many tropes. I know my former coworker at the Hackender Report, Nikki Dobo, has written about this some. I think there's a lot of people who, if they hear rural, they just go straight to Appalachia and write a everyone's missing their teeth and everything else story. So I would avoid that. And actually, a lot of the comments on my story were like, why didn't you write about a white person in rural America? Why didn't you go to Appalachia? So I think people do just think rural just means you're living in the hollers, destitute. One reason I wanted to do this story is because I felt like rural had become a synonym for white in popular culture. And most of rural Louisiana, as I have experienced it, is Black, as is most of rural Mississippi. And when I first came up with this story, Old Town Road was really popular, that Lil Nas X song. And it seemed like a good time to remind people that country is not just white and actually has a lot of roots in Black culture. So I think there's more to do with that. A lot of places in South Carolina and Georgia and other southern states are also primarily Black. But I think just covering them at all is worthwhile. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who were upset that my story cast all of rural America as being in a tragedy. The headline is The Tragedy of Rural Schools. And a lot of people are upset and they want positive stories written about rural schools, which I understand. The way the news works, that's often really hard to do because you can't sell an editor that easily on everything's going great in this place. Why don't we write about it? I really don't know what to do about that. That's not a problem that's just relegated to rural America. But one story I'd like to see covered more is reconnecting McDowell in West Virginia. I have no idea how successful they've been or not, but I know they just celebrated their 10-year anniversary, so it could be a good time to check back in to see what, if any, progress they've made. What have they tried that worked? What have they tried that didn't work? Because maybe it's a good roadmap for other places to take.
You bring us into Harvey Ellington's world, and we really care about him. And then, of course, this story comes to an end. But I'm wondering what's happened since the story was published. Have people been reaching out to him?
Oh, yes. Lots of people have wanted to write to Harvey, which is very exciting for him. Someone called him or emailed him from Australia, and he called me crying because he was so happy to hear from someone from Australia. A man in Michigan whose last name is Polish sent him some money. And Harvey called me and he was like, well, what do you think this last name is? Do you think this is Italian or French? I was like, God, I think it's Polish. But he's just kind of getting this geographical education right now, just hearing from different people. Some people have wanted to send money, but anyone who's written me, I've told them, hey, if you feel like reaching out to him, here's his email address, because he just loves hearing from people. I think quite a few people have sent me emails saying, we don't know what to do, so can we just send him some money, which is great for him. And he definitely has a lot of need. Like, he used the money the guy from Michigan sent him to buy a cap and gown for graduation. He's trying to save up money to buy a car so that when he applies for college, he can actually get there, and he's hoping to get a job, but he can't get a job without a car. But that doesn't necessarily help any of the other students who are there, and it doesn't help the bigger issue. I think sometimes that can just give people a little bit of relief over their guilt. The issue is it's a really hard problem to solve, and I'm not sure that just like donations will help, because there's so many generations of people who have been undereducated there, and there are such huge holes with teaching positions. And that's not just in Holmes. I just Googled before we talked today to see if there was any update I should mention. And there are multiple states talking about how they're having trouble recruiting teachers, even more so now after COVID. What a reader can do about that, short of like deciding to become a teacher themselves, I don't know. And then the position itself is really hard. And sometimes when you have Teach for America volunteers go down there, they get super overwhelmed and they don't stay beyond their 2-year post, or they're not actually that effective because they don't have the social training to be in those situations.
Casey, a persistent challenge for education journalists, most of whom are white women, is writing about students who don't look like us and communities that may be very different from the ones that we grew up in or experienced. And I'm wondering how you approach that.
Well, I think the best reporters can ever do is be humble and not act as if they know everything, and also not expect their sources to train them up on the fly. I think doing a lot of your own research beforehand is really good. I think also being aware of what some of the tropes are. One thing that I've been trying to challenge myself with in recent years, which sometimes doesn't work out because editors have different ideas, but I want to try to do more stories where the Black kids in my stories are not all victims and where people have some agency and empowerment. Even in this story, like, though it is a very sad story, it was really important to me to start off with Harvey in a position of power. So the story starts off with him writing an email full of ideas to his teacher. And I just really wanted to show, like, hey, this is a kid who has a lot of great ideas, who has agency, and who's trying things, rather than just starting with him in the gym doing nothing. And I think I see a lot of stories where white reporters, I think probably from our own guilt or something, I don't really know, love to write sad stories about Black kids, and the kids don't come across as having that agency or power or brilliance. They're just cardboard cutouts of sadness. I think another way you can address that if you don't have that powerful scene is to just make sure you write people as specifically as possible. Give them distinguishing characteristics, which takes reporting to find out what those are. Describe what they look like, not describing them as food. And then otherwise, just like when you're there, I think don't fake anything, like be yourself. And like, I try not to talk down to Harvey. Like, I just talk to him as I would talk to any other source and try not to act too cool or anything like that. This is a really hard thing to describe because some of it is just innate. And I just usually show up as myself. And in situations like this, because I am from Louisiana and spent so much time in Mississippi, like, I just go down as my Southern self. And that's that. I don't like think of a game plan before I go down of like, how should I act? Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm curious, though, in terms of your game plan, are there certain questions you ask every time? Or are there ones that you keep in your back pocket for when there may be a lull or to get somebody to loosen up?
Oh gosh, I'm horrible in that I never have any game plan. I just go down and do, and then like hang out and then see what happens. I don't take notes that often, partially because I have a connective tissue disorder and my arms don't work that well. But also, I think it can be a little intimidating. And so I usually just run my phone recording everything, which then is kind of a transcription nightmare later. But I try to be open about as much as I can as a person and like share my own stories. So in this case with the superintendent, like I talked to him about my mom. I talk about my own experiences in Louisiana. I find that the more open I am, the more open other people are. And from there, like, I don't usually come with a list of questions. I just spend a little bit of time getting to know people. And then as things come up, I ask them follow-up questions.
You talk about some of your personal stories and using those to help folks. I think your sincerity and your interest in them, but you also have written very personally about your own life, and you have a book coming out, and that has generated a lot of buzz and attention. It actually won a big award for a book in progress. I'll be honest, Casey, I did not know that was something they gave out, so congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's a lot of money.
It is. It's Diary of a Misfit, and it comes out next summer. Can you tell us just a minute or two about that?
Yeah, after I first came out as gay back when I was living in Mississippi in 2002, everyone in my family was pretty much upset. My pastor asked God to kill me. He said, Lord, save her and take her. And my mom told me that thinking of me made her want to throw up. And my grandma pulled me aside and said, I grew up across the street from a woman who lived as a man. And she told me that her neighbor had kidnapped this child, who she said was a female child, and then raised him as a boy. And then my grandma had met him later in life when he was a country singer in rural Louisiana. And my grandma basically wanted me to solve this kidnapping mystery and then find out what had happened to him because she had lost touch with him. And so the book follows me over the course of 10 years, where I just keep going back to this rural town to find out about this guy, Roy. And along the way, like, there's a lot of my own family stuff that comes up, because I really fled the South because I was gay and because my pastor wanted me to die. And I just kept getting harassed there. But I never really made my peace with leaving. And as I said earlier, the only way I can ever think to go back to the South is through work. So the book is kind of a memoir of being a journalist and returning to this place that I had a lot of pain over, and to family members that I had a lot of pain over, in the name of doing this story. And we kind of like all bond through doing this story. And then it's also the actual story is in the story. So it's kind of like a book about the making of itself. It's a little bit odd, but I hope it's interesting. And it was a little freaky to do, but also very meaningful.
Your new beat is gender and family. I hope that means you'll still be able to cross back onto education.
I hope so too. I am having the distinct, frightening experience of not knowing what I'm talking about yet. I know a lot about education stuff at this point, but I don't know a ton about gender and family. So I'm trying to catch up in real time. Last week, I had to write about the child tax credit, and I realized I did not know anything about it, and then was supposed to appear in the newspaper as the expert. I had worked like double-digit hours trying to get up to speed on it. But a lot of the stories, I think, will cross over into school, so hopefully I'll be back in them soon.
Is there an education story you'd like to see reporters tackling, maybe one that you have to leave behind?
Well, in the rural beat, I'm really curious. Georgia just started a new Office of Rural Education. So if there are any reporters there, I'd love to see like how that's working out. I would love to see someone truly follow a school as it gets and spends the ESSER money. There's so much. I mean, Holmes County is about to get $30 million, but because there's so many parameters on it, they can't actually use it for the things that they need most. So I'm just curious, like, what happens with that influx of money? Does it actually help? Is it just completely wasted? It's kind of a wonky story, I guess, but I think the best stories have like a wonky underpinning that you can't quite see, but you feel when you're done with it.
Casey Parks has just joined the Washington Post as a staff reporter, and she's a longtime education journalist as well, and the author of the forthcoming book, Diary of a Misfit. Casey, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank y'all.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a reporter or a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. Take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.